everyone! Welcome to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. Today I will be reading Owl at Home by Arnold Lobel and another chapter from the Paddington Treasury. I have this beautiful birthday card on my desk that one of my friends made for me, so thank you very much, Mr. Bear. I appreciate it. So, I think I'm going to wear my crown today because it's Monday, and on Monday we wear crowns. Okay. Arnold Lobel you might also know from the Frog and Toad series, which I have read before. Those are on YouTube. And I have a couple more Frog and Toad books as well, so we will read those. But I like Owl at Home, so here we go. And there are several chapters in this book. The first one is The Guess. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. It's a little bit of a shadow. I'm hoping you can see the picture. Owl was at home. "How good it feels to be sitting by the fire," said Owl. "It is so cold and snowy outside." Owl was eating buttered toast and hot pea soup for supper. Owl heard a loud sound at the front door. "Who is out there, banging and pounding at my door on a night like this?" said Owl. Owl opened the door. No one was there. Only the snow and the wind. See, yeah, there we go. Owl sat near the fire again. There was another loud noise at the door. "Who can it be?" said Owl, "knocking and thumping at my door on a night like this?" Owl opened the door. No one was there, only the snow and the cold. "The poor old winter is knocking at my door," said Owl. "Perhaps it wants to sit by the fire. Well, I will be kind and let the winter come in." Owl opened the door very wide. "Come in, Winter," he said. "Come in and warm yourself for a while." Winter came into the house. It came in very fast. A cold wind pushed Owl against the wall. Winter ran around the room. It blew out the fire in the fireplace. The snow whirled up the stairs and whooshed down the hallway. "Winter!" cried Owl. "You are my guest. This is no way to behave." But Winter did not listen. It made the window shades flap and shiver. It turned the pea soup into a hard, green icicle. Winter went into all the rooms of Owl's house. Soon everything was covered with snow. "You must go, Winter!" shouted Owl. "Go away, right now!" The wind blew around and around. Then Winter rushed out and slammed the front door. "Goodbye," called Owl, "and do not come back." Owl made a new fire in the fireplace. The room became warm again. The snow melted away. The hard, green ice turned back into soft pea soup. Owl sat down in his chair and quietly finished his supper. The next chapter is called Strange Bumps. Owl was in bed. "It is time to blow out the candle and go to sleep," he said, with a yawn. The owl saw 2 bumps under his blanket at the bottom of his bed. "What can those strange bumps be?" asked Owl. Owl lifted up the blanket. He looked down into the bed. All he could see was darkness. Owl tried to sleep, but he could not. "What if those strange bumps grow bigger and bigger while I am asleep?" said Owl. "That would not be pleasant." Owl moved his right foot up and down. The bump on the right side moved up and down. "One of those bumps is moving," said Owl. Owl moved his left foot up and down. The bump on the left moved up and down, too. "The other bump is moving!" cried Owl. Owl pulled all of the covers off his bed. The bumps were gone. All Owl could see at the bottom of the bed were his own 2 feet. "But now I am cold," said Owl. "I will cover myself with the blankets again." As soon as he did, he saw the same 2 bumps. "Those bumps are back!" shouted Owl. "Bumps, bumps, bumps! I will never sleep tonight." Owl jumped up and down on top of his bed. "Where are you? What are you?" he cried. With a crash and a bang, the bed came falling down. Owl ran down the stairs. He sat in his chair near the fire. "I will let those two strange bumps sit on my bed all by themselves," said Owl. "Let them grow as big as they wish. I will sleep right here where I am safe." And that is what he did. This is called Tear-Water Tea. Owl took the kettle out of the cupboard. "Tonight I will make tear-water tea," he said. He put the kettle on his lap. "Now," said Owl, "I will begin." Owl sat very still. He began to think of things that were sad. "Chairs with broken legs?" said Owl. His eyes began to water. "Songs that cannot be sung," said Owl, because the words had been forgotten. Owl began to cry. A large tear rolled down and dropped into the kettle. "Spoons that have fallen behind the stove and are never seen again," said Owl. More dropped it down into the kettle. "Books that cannot be read because some of the pages have been turned out," said Owl. "Clocks that have stopped," said Owl, with no one near to wind them up. Owl was crying. Many large tears dropped into the kettle. "Mornings nobody saw because everybody was sleeping," said Owl. "Mashed potatoes left on a plate," he cried, "because no one wanted to eat them, and pencils that are too short to use." Owl thought about many other sad things. He cried and cried. Soon the kettle was all filled up with tears. "There," said Owl. "That does it." Owl stopped crying. He and the kettle on the stove put the kettle on the stove to boil for tea. Owl felt happy as he filled his cup. "It tastes a little bit salty," he said, "but tear-water tea is always very good." This chapter is Upstairs and Downstairs. Owl's house had an upstairs and a downstairs. There were 20 steps on the stairway. Some of the time, Owl was upstairs in his bedroom. At other times, Owl was downstairs in his living room. When Owl was downstairs, he said, "I wonder how my upstairs is." When Owl was upstairs, he said, "I wonder how my downstairs is going along. I am always missing one place or the other. There must be a way," said Owl, "to be upstairs and to be downstairs at the same time. Perhaps if I run very, very fast, I can be in both places at once." Owl ran up the stairs. "I am up," he said. Owl ran down the stairs. "I am down," he said. Owl ran up the stairs and down the stairs faster and faster. "Owl!" he cried. There was no answer. "No," said Owl. "I am not downstairs because I am upstairs. I am not running fast enough." "Owl!" he shouted. "Are you upstairs?" There was no answer. "No," said Owl. "I am not upstairs because I am downstairs. I must run even faster." "Faster, faster, faster!" cried Owl. Owl ran upstairs and downstairs all evening, but he could not be in both places at once. "When I am up," said Owl, "I am not down. When I am down, I am not up. All I am is very tired." Owl sat down to rest. He sat on the 10th step because it was the place that was high in the middle. And the last chapter is called Owl and the Moon. One night, Owl went down to the seashore. He sat on a large rock and looked out at the waves. Everything was dark. Then a small tip of the moon came up over the edge of the sea. Owl watched the moon. It climbed higher and higher into the sky. Soon the whole round moon was shining. Owl sat on the rock and looked up at the moon for a long time. "If I am looking at you, moon, then you must be looking back at me. We must be very good friends." The moon did not answer, but Owl said, "I will come back and see you again, moon, but now I must go home." Owl walked down the path. He looked up at the sky. The moon was still there. It was following him. "No, no, Moon," said Owl. "It is kind of you to light my way, but you must stay up over the sea where you look so fine." Owl walked on a little further. He looked at the sky again. There was the moon coming right along with him. "Dear Moon," said Owl, "you really must not come home with me. My house is small. You would not fit through the door, and I have nothing to give you for supper." Owl kept on walking. The moon sailed after him over the tops of the trees. "Moon," said Owl, "I think that you do not hear me." Owl climbed to the top of a hill. He shouted as loudly as he could, "Goodbye, Moon!" The moon went behind some clouds. Owl looked and looked. The moon was gone. "It is always a little sad to say goodbye to a friend," said Owl. Owl came home. He put on his pajamas and went to bed. The room was very dark. Owl was still feeling sad. All at once, Owl's bedroom was filled with silver light. Owl looked out of the window. The moon was coming from behind the clouds. "Moon, you have followed me all the way home. What a good round friend you are," said Owl. Then Owl put his head on the pillow and closed his eyes. The moon was shining down through the window. Owl did not feel sad at all. And that is Owl at Home by Arnold Lobel. So we have another chapter of Paddington to go through. I am nowhere near done with this book, so we will have lots and lots of Paddington stories still left to get through. But like I said, if you have suggestions for books you would like me to read, definitely leave them on the Facebook page, and I will try to ethically source them. And then when I've read them, once donations open back up at charities and places like that, I will donate the books that I buy. All right. So, I don't think I have read this one. Yes. So we have Chapter 11, Paddington and Do It Yourself. "I've brought you your breakfast in bed," Mrs. Brown said to Paddington, "because Mrs. Bird and I have to go out this morning. We're taking Jonathan and Judy to the dentist, and we thought perhaps you wouldn't mind being left on your own. Unless," she added, "you'd like to come too?" "Oh, no," Paddington said hastily. "I don't think I should like to go to the dentist. Thank you very much. I'd much rather stay at home." Mrs. Brown paused in the doorway. "We shan't be any longer than we can help. You're sure you'll be all right?" "I expect I shall find something to do," Paddington said vaguely. Mrs. Brown hesitated before shutting the door. She would have liked to have asked Paddington a few more questions. He had a faraway look in his eyes that she did not like the look of at all. But she was already late for the appointment, and conversation with Paddington, particularly in the early morning, was liable to become complicated. When Mrs. Bird heard about Paddington's strange behavior, she hurried upstairs to see what was going on, but she arrived back a few moments later with the news that he was sitting up in bed, eating his breakfast and reading a catalogue. "Oh, well," said Mrs. Brown, looking most relieved. "He can't come to too much harm doing that." In recent weeks, Paddington had begun to collect catalogues, and whenever he saw an interesting one advertised in the newspapers, he usually sent away for it. In fact, hardly a day went by without the postman calling at least once with a letter addressed to P. Brown, Esquire. Some of the catalogues were very good value indeed, full of pictures and drawings, and with quite a lot to read considering that they were free and that Mrs. Bird usually paid for the stamp. Paddington kept them all in a cupboard beside his bed. There were a number on foreign travel, with pictures of exotic places in several colors, 2 or 3 on food, and 1 or 2 from some big London stores. But the one which interested Paddington at the moment, and which was his favorite, showed a workbench on the front cover and was headed, "Do It Yourself." He became so absorbed in the booklet, which was a thick one full of diagrams, that he suddenly found to his surprise that he had put the pepper and salt into his cup of tea and the sugar into his boiled egg. But it made quite an interesting taste, so he didn't really mind, and he concentrated on reading the catalogue over his toast and marmalade. There was a particularly interesting section that caught his eye. It was headed, "Delight your family and surprise your friends," and it was all about making a newspaper and magazine rack. "All you need," it said, "is a sheet of plywood, some nails, and a kitchen table." Paddington wasn't at all sure about using Mrs. Bird's kitchen table, but the night before Mr. Brown had rashly promised him a sheet of plywood that was standing in the shed, as well as some old nails and a jam jar. And Mr. Brown was always grumbling about not being able to find his newspapers. Paddington felt sure that he would be very pleased to have a rack for them. He examined the drawings and pictures carefully and consulted the instructions several times. It didn't say anything in particular about bears doing carpentry, but it did say it was suitable for anyone with a set of tools. Paddington came to a decision. He hastily bundled the remains of his breakfast in a handkerchief, in case the sawing made him hungry. Then, having marked the chapter on magazine racks in his catalogue with a piece of marmalade peel, he hurried along to the bathroom for a quick wash. Paddington was not the sort of bear who believed in doing things unnecessarily, and it wasn't worth having a proper wash if he was just going to get dirty again. After passing the washcloth over his whiskers a couple of times, he made his way downstairs and went out into the garden. A box of carpenter's tools was standing in the middle of Mr. Brown's shed, and Paddington spent several minutes investigating it. Although all the tools seemed rather large for a bear, he soon decided he was very pleased with them. There was a hammer, a plane, 3 chisels, a large saw, and a number of other things which he did not immediately recognize, but which looked very interesting. The box was heavy, and it took him some while to drag it outside into the garden. He had even more trouble with Mr. Brown's plywood, for it was a large sheet, and there was a wind blowing. Every time he picked it up, a gust of wind caught it and carried him farther and farther down the garden. It was while he was trying to drag it back up again with the aid of a piece of rope that he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He looked around and saw Mr. Curry watching him over the fence. Mr. Curry didn't approve of bears, and he usually viewed Paddington's goings-on with suspicion. "What are you doing, bear?" he growled. "Do it yourself, Mr. Curry," said Paddington, peering out from behind the sheet of wood. "What?" bellowed Mr. Curry. "Don't be impertinent, bear!" "Oh, no," said Paddington hastily, nearly dropping the sheet of plywood in his fright at the expression on Mr. Curry's face. And here we see Paddington wrestling with the square of plywood. "I didn't mean you were to do it yourself, Mr. Curry. I meant I'm going to do it myself. I'm making a magazine rack for Mr. Brown." "A magazine rack?" repeated Mr. Curry. "Yes," said Paddington importantly, and he began explaining to Mr. Curry all about his new carpentry set. As he listened to Paddington, the expression on Mr. Curry's face gradually changed. Mr. Curry had a reputation in the neighborhood for being somewhat cheap, and he was always on the lookout in the hope of getting something for nothing. He was very keen on doing things himself, too, in order to save money, and he cast several envious glances at Paddington's tool set. He said when Paddington had finished. "And where are you going to make this magazine rack, On the lawn?" "Well," said Paddington doubtfully, "it's a bit difficult. It says in the instructions I'm supposed to have a kitchen table, and Mrs. Bird's is full." Said Mr. Curry once again. "If I let you make me a magazine rack, bear, you can use my kitchen table." "Thank you very much, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. But he wasn't sure whether it was a good idea or not, and he looked at Mr. Curry rather doubtfully. "That's most kind of you." "I have to go out this morning," said Mr. Curry, "so you can have it ready for me when I get back. Mind you," he added, as he reached over the fence to give Paddington a hand with the plywood, "I'm not having any sawdust over the kitchen floor, and be careful you don't scratch anything." The more he listened, the longer Paddington's face grew, and he was glad when at last Mr. Curry left to do his shopping. But as Paddington set to work, he soon forgot all about Mr. Curry's lists of don'ts, for there were a number of important things to be done. First of all, he took a pencil and ruler and carefully marked out the shape of the magazine rack on the sheet of plywood. Then he placed this on top of the kitchen table, ready to be sawed in two. Paddington had never actually sawed anything before, but he had often watched Mr. Brown cutting up logs for the fire. From a safe distance, it had always looked easy, but Paddington soon found it wasn't easy at all. To start with, the plywood was bigger than the top of Mr. Curry's table. Being small, Paddington had to climb on top of it, and several times it nearly tipped over when he stood too near the edge. Then he found the saw, although it was nice and sharp, was so large that he had to use both paws, which made things even more difficult. For the first strokes it went through the wood like a knife through butter, but for some reason or other it gradually became harder and harder to use. After sitting down for a short rest, Paddington decided to try from the other end, but once again, for some strange reason, he found it much easier at the beginning. However, as he made the last saw cut and scrambled clear, he was pleased to see the two saw cuts met in the middle, dividing the sheet of plywood neatly in half. It was then, as he reached up to take the newly sawed pieces of plywood down, that Paddington had his first shock of the morning. There was a loud splintering noise, and he dodged back just in time to avoid being hit by Mr. Curry's table, as it suddenly parted in the middle and fell with a crash to the floor. Paddington sat in the middle of the kitchen floor with a mournful expression on his face for quite some time, surveying the wreckage and trying to think of a good reason why Mr. Curry would like 2 small tables with only 2 legs each, instead of one big one with 4 legs. He consulted the instructions in his catalog hopefully several times, but there didn't seem to be anything about mending tables that had accidentally been sawed in half. In all the pictures, the people seemed to be happy and smiling, and their kitchens were shiny as a new pin. Whereas, looking unhappily around Mr. Curry's kitchen, even Paddington had to admit it was in a bit of a mess. And here is Paddington consulting his instructions. He tried propping the 2 pieces of table up on some old cardboard boxes, but there was still a nasty sag in the middle, and even with the curtains drawn and the light out, it was obvious something was wrong. Paddington was a hopeful bear in many ways, and he suddenly remembered seeing a large tube of glue in his toolbox. If he spread some of the glue along the 2 edges and nailed them together for good measure, perhaps even Mr. Curry might not notice anything was wrong. He worked hard for some minutes, and by the time he had finished, he felt quite pleased with himself. Admittedly, the table had a funny tilt to one side, and seemed a trifle wobbly, but it was definitely in one piece again. He spread some flour over the joint, and then stood back to admire his handiwork. Having carefully examined it from all angles, he decided he might be able to improve matters still further by sawing a piece off one of the legs. But when he had done that, the table seemed to lean the opposite way, which meant he had to saw a piece off one of the other legs as well. Then, when he had done that, he discovered the table was leaning the other way again. Paddington gave a deep sigh. Carpentry was much more difficult than it looked. He was sure the man in the catalog didn't have so much trouble. It was after he had been at work for some time that he stood up and received his second shock of the morning. When he had first started sawing the legs, Mr. Curry's table had been as tall as he was. Now, he found that he was looking down on it. In fact, he didn't remember ever having seen such a short table before, and his eyes nearly popped out with astonishment. He sat down on the pile of sawed-off table legs and consulted his catalog once again. "Delight your family and surprise your friends," he said bitterly to the world in general. He was quite sure Mr. Curry would be surprised when he saw his kitchen table, but as for anyone being delighted by their magazine racks, well, he hadn't even started work on those yet. Mrs. Brown looked anxiously at the dining-room clock. "I wonder where on earth Paddington can have got to," she said. "It's almost lunchtime, and it's most unlike him to be late for a meal." "Perhaps he's doing a job somewhere," said Jonathan. "I looked in the shed just now, and the toolbox has disappeared." "And that sheet of plywood Daddy gave him," said Judy. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I do hope he hasn't built himself in anywhere and can't get out. You know what he's like." "I don't know about Paddington building himself in," said Mrs. Bird as she entered carrying a tray of plates. "I think Mr. Curry must be having his house pulled down. I've never heard so much noise. Banging and sawing coming from the kitchen. It's been going on ever since we got back, and it's only just this minute stopped." Jonathan and Judy exchanged glances. Now that Mrs. Bird mentioned it, there had been a lot of noise coming from Mr. Curry's house. "I wonder," said Judy. Jonathan opened his mouth, but before he had time to say anything, the door burst open, and Paddington entered, dragging something large and heady behind him. "Well," said Mrs. Bird, voicing all their thoughts, "and what have you been up to now?" "What have I been up to, Mrs. Bird?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended. "I I've been making Mr. Brown a magazine rack." "A magazine rack," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington stepped to one side. "What a lovely idea." "It was meant to be a surprise," said Paddington modestly. "I made it all with my own paws." "Gosh, it's super," said Jonathan, as the Browns all crowded around to admire Paddington's handiwork. "Fancy you doing it all by yourself." "I should be careful," said Paddington. "I've only just varnished it, and it's still a bit sticky. I think some of it has come off on my paws already." "Most sensible," said Mrs. Bird approvingly. "Mentioning no names, it's about time some people in this house had a place for their newspapers. Now, perhaps they won't keep losing them." "But you've made two," said Judy. "Whose is the other one?" A guilty expression came over Paddington's face. "It's really for Mr. Curry," he said, "but I thought perhaps I'd better leave it on his doorstep after dark, just in case." Mrs. Bird looked at Paddington suspiciously. Her ears had caught the sound of the violent banging coming from the house next door, and she had a nasty feeling in the back of her mind that it had something to do with Paddington. "Just in case," she repeated. "What do you mean?" But before Paddington had time to explain exactly what he did mean, Mrs. Brown pointed to the window in astonishment. "Good gracious!" she cried. "There is Mr. Curry! Whatever's the matter with him? He's running round the garden waving a kitchen table in the air." She peered through the glass. "And it doesn't seem to have any legs either. How very odd!" "Gosh!" cried Jonathan excitedly. "Now it's broken in two!" The Browns stared through the window at the strange sight of Mr. Curry dancing around his pond waving the two halves of a table. "Bear!" he shouted. "Where are you, Bear?" "Oh, dear," said Paddington, as everyone turned away from the window and looked at him accusingly. "I'm in trouble again." "Well, if you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, after he had explained everything to them, "the best thing you can offer to do is give Mr. Curry your toolbox as a present. Then perhaps he'll forget all about his kitchen table. And if he doesn't, you just tell him to come and see me." Mrs. Bird held very strong views about people who tried to take advantage of others, and she usually took Paddington's side in anything to do with Mr. Curry. "Anyway," she concluded, in a voice that left no room for argument, "I'm certainly not having the lunch spoiled by Mr. Curry or anyone else, so just you all sit down while I fetch it." With that argument the Browns had to agree, and they meekly arranged themselves around the table. Paddington in particular thought it was a very good idea. He was a bit fed up with carpentry. Sawing was hard work, especially for a small bear, and even more so when it was sawing through a kitchen table. Besides, he was hungry after his morning's work, and he didn't want to offend Mrs. Bird by not eating her lunch down to the very last mouthful. And that concludes part 2 of our Paddington Treasury. So I hope you have enjoyed the stories today. I will be back here at noon tomorrow for another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, get out in the sun if you can, and do something fun. Bye!